I don't want people to think that there is no risk associated with Australia's plan to acquire nuclear powered submarines. There is significant risk. But as those who operate in business know, there is always risk. The question is, do you understand the risk? And are you taking actions to mitigate the risk? And my view of Australia's plan right now is they understand the risk and actions are in place to mitigate the risks.
Most of the goods we consume, the energy we use, and of course, the technology and our economies, they all depend on travel through, over, or beneath the world's oceans. And nowhere is this more important or perhaps more contested. And I'm not talking about the Strait of Hormuz, but actually the Indo-Pacific region. And this region contains some of the world's busiest shipping routes, critical ports, subsea communication cables, and strategically important waterways. And this is where Chinese military power is expanding. It's where tensions around Taiwan, tensions actually right across the South China Sea continuing to grow. And it's where the United States, Australia, South Korea, Japan are all investing heavily into preserving deterrence and, of course, what we call freedom of navigation. Now, for Australia, the answer has been AUKUS, which is a multi decade partnership between the US, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Now, supporters see AUKUS as an essential investment in deterrence and Australia's national resilience. Critics see it as a costly, technologically uncertain, and actually increasing Australia's dependence on the United States. I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm host of the International Risk Podcast, where we unpack the topics that really matter. And joining us today to unpack all of this is Jennifer Parker. She's an adjunct professor of practice at the University of Western Australia's Defence and Security Institute. And she's also a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute. Jennifer, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on.
Jennifer, whereabouts in the world do we find you today?
So I am in Canberra, which is our nation's capital. Sydney is not the capital of Australia, by the way. Sydney is not the capital of Australia. Canberra is the capital of Australia. And it was 1 degree this morning. So, yeah, it's pretty cold in Australia's national capital right now.
I think a lot of our podcast listeners right now will be Googling what is the capital of Australia, because most people think it's Sydney. They think it should be Melbourne, but it actually is Canberra. So no, thanks for clarifying all of that for us.
It's a great trivia question. I just helped all of you, so you're welcome.
Now, a very serious deterioration in the Indo-Pacific region would affect shipping, unquestionably. A lot of the crisis management exercises we run, a lot of the contingency planning and the scenario development we do for European countries actually revolves around shipping, insurance, energy prices, technology supply chains, investment decisions, and business continuity, all coming out of the Indo-Pacific regions. But there's still a lot of companies that are poorly prepared for the speed of which strategic competition could increase in the region. Can you talk to us about what you're seeing change in the region? You've spent your career on the water and in land exploring the Indo-Pacific region. What do we need to know about what's happening there today?
Well, I guess, when I think about the Indo-Pacific region, of course, the Indo-Pacific in itself being a contested concept, right? It's a geographical concept. It demonstrates the maritime connectivity of the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean through Southeast Asia and Oceania, but also it's a strategic concept about the inclusion of India into this region. But it is predominantly a maritime domain. I think that's really important when we think about what are the trends that are changing this region. From a security perspective, what we're seeing is this increasing contestation in the maritime domain. And we see that manifest in a number of ways. We see that manifest most obviously in the South China Sea, where we see China's 9-line claim, which 10th anniversary of the 2016 arbitral tribunal this week, which the arbitral tribunal reaffirmed that China's 9-line claim, which is a claim to 90% of the South China Sea, is invalidated and not consistent with international law. But we still see China prosecuting that with naval vessels, coast guard vessels, and maritime militia, and quite aggressively towards the Philippines and within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. Beyond that, we do see China's growing military changing these strategic dynamics in the region. Look, certainly you expect a country with the economy that has grown like China's to have a growing military. That makes sense. But it is a different balance for the region, especially as we see China's power projection capabilities extending the reach of their military. For Australia, we've largely lived in a region where not many countries could reach out and touch us. We often talked about the protection of distance as Achilles' heel because we're dependent on the maritime domain, but I'll come back to that. But we've recently seen the Chinese Navy
Mhm.
circumnavigate Australia in 2025. Australia, by the way, if you need to look at a map, is not on its way to anywhere. Like, unless you're going to visit the penguins, it's not on its way to anywhere. So, this was a clear demonstration of capability. So we see increased naval operations. We certainly see increased contestation in the Indian Ocean. We see China conducting a lot of survey operations, obviously precursors to increasing submarine operations. We also, of course, see other countries building up their militaries. We see India building up its military. We see Southeast Asian and Northeast Asian countries building up their military. And we see Australia building up their military. So we see all of these dynamics happening in the Indo Pacific, which is changing the maritime domain, and the maritime domain is increasingly contested. And you don't need to look any further than the 4th of March this year, where we saw a US Virginia class submarine actually torpedo an Iranian warship 40 nautical miles to the south of Sri Lanka on what is one of the most critical sea lanes in the Indo Pacific, which effectively connects uh, the Middle East and Europe through to the Strait of Malacca and into Southeast Asia. So, all of those dynamics, China's increasing aggressiveness, China's growing military capability, the broader region's growing military capability. And I think the final thing I'd add to that is a global trend that is impacting the Indo Pacific, which is the increasing willingness of states to use military force to achieve their foreign policy objectives. Now, we see that in Venezuela. We're seeing that in the Middle East right now. We saw that in Russia and Ukraine. We see that in China's actions in the South China Sea. Equally, we saw that last year between India and Pakistan, Thailand and Cambodia. I could keep going on, but all of those things are making this maritime region increasingly contested.
Yeah, interesting. And that takes us into AUKUS. What is the AUKUS actually designed to achieve? Then we get to the point of it. Can Australia actually deliver it? And what is it that business leaders around the world, certainly our Australian audience, has probably heard a lot about it in the media, but those listening from around the world, how does this impact the maritime balance of power across the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. I think it's important to start with what is AUKUS. AUKUS, AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, not orcas, as in the whales. They are. This conversation is often confused. So just to clarify, look, it is Australia's plan to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. It is more than that. So there is Pillar One, acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. Pillar Two, which is working on more advanced technologies between the three countries. So quantum sensing, uncrewed underwater vehicles, those kind of areas. Um, what does it mean and how should the business community interpret it? Uh, the first thing is look, Australia has wanted nuclear powered submarines since the 1960s, right? This has been an ongoing conversation. But no Australian government has honestly been willing to ask the question, and no US government has been willing to transfer the technology, realistically. Now they are. What does that mean? That means that both of those countries see a deteriorating region in the Indo Pacific where they view the fact that Australia does really need that capability. So I think that's kind of the first thing to take away from it, that the reason for AUKUS is really because of how much this region has changed. That's why we now see political support for something that, the Australian Navy's wanted since the 1960s. I think the second element of it is this is Australia really recognizing and leaning into its maritime vulnerability. And I think that's something that countries around the world are increasingly thinking about. Of course, we've seen a number of attacks on subsea cables and pipelines. We've seen increasing attacks on shipping, Strait of Hormuz, very clearly right now, but that is not the only example. We see attacks from the Black Sea, both Ukrainian and Russian attacks. We saw the blockade around Venezuela, etc. So Australia realizes its vulnerability in the maritime domain. The third thing I'd say, and probably less relevant for business, but why is Australia leaning into nuclear powered submarines? Well, Australia has the third largest exclusive economic zone in the world. We import well over 90% of our goods through the maritime domain, including critical goods like fuel, fertilizer, helium, all of this critical stuff that keeps the economy going. And I think that the acquisition of nuclear powered submarines, and that's not all Australia's doing in defence, by the way. Sometimes it's overhyped a little bit because Australia's doing a lot more than that. But it is a recognition of that dependency and vulnerability for an island nation like Australia.
And the Indo-Pacific often, and I'm really appreciate you mentioning a few other countries before when you introduce the Indo-Pacific region. But often when we read the news, if we read The Economist or Bloomberg or New York Times, you would be fooled into believing it is only a competition between Washington and Beijing. But as you've started to talk about it, it's so much more. There's these critical sea lines. There's these manufacturing centers in many. You spoke about Malaysia before. Of course, you've got Singapore, India, many other really important nations. You've got energy routes, ports, digital infrastructure, and companies and consumers all around the world depend on them. In fact, quite interestingly, Sweden's largest supermarket, 90% of goods, even the ones that come from Europe, actually get shipped to China for packaging before being sent to Europe. It's absolutely phenomenal, some of the supply chain decisions that are made. And they make sense from a commercial point of view sometimes, but certainly we see the fragility in the last certainly 5 or so years. But help us understand, why should our listeners, why should a chief executive in London or Stockholm or Frankfurt or New York care about the changing balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region? India increasing its naval size, Australia acquiring nuclear powered submarines, China increasing its deep water fleet. Why does that matter?
Well, look, I think that when you talk about the globalized nature of supply chains, which if we think of the recent example of, well, it's not so recent now, but COVID, right, really brought home to us how globalized supply chains are. Um, a lot of companies, and look, I'm not an economist, I'm not a CEO, I'm a strategist, but a lot of companies have made the assumption that, look, it makes sense to maybe package your things in China and things
Hmm.
like that, but you're making that assumption in a low risk geopolitical environment. But the risk is changing. And so the, I guess, cost or expense of diversifying or expanding how you do those things or bringing that production home versus the risk of not having access to that because you have contested sea lines of communication, because ships can't get through, God forbid, a certain choke point as we're experiencing right now. That is where you need to think about how that risk that you're accepting is changing because of this contestation in the Indo Pacific. And what would happen if there was a crisis or if there was a regional conflict? And if I go back to what I said about one of the key trends that is changing the world, but dramatically impacting the Indo Pacific, this fact that states are increasingly willing to use force to achieve their foreign policy objectives. Now, since the 90s and the end of the Cold War, there was this assumption about the end of history that a globalized economy would mean that it was too much of a risk for countries to go to war because of the economic impact on them. If we look at much of the recent conflicts, and in fact, 2024, by the way, here's a grim statistic, more state on state conflict in 2024 than any other time since World War II. The nature of globalized economies, the economic impact of disrupting that is not stopping states from entering conflict. So this is a risk that I think whatever business you're in, if it's a globalized business, you need to be factoring into your planning.
And I think, we're seeing Chinese military exercises around Taiwan becoming much larger, much more frequent, and with much less predictability. China's built and militarized artificial islands across the South China Sea. But I think business leaders really need to distinguish between what's persistent strategic competition and actually a genuine deterioration that demands their attention. So, how would you, when you're speaking with your clients and business leaders, is the Indo-Pacific region becoming more dangerous, or is this something that's more at the political level or the defense establishment level and something that they need to worry about?
No, I think it's something that everybody needs to worry about. Is it becoming more dangerous? Yes. And we've already gone through a number of the key KPIs that indicate that things are dramatically changing in the Indo Pacific region. And this isn't as of yesterday, this is now a trend of the last decade, to be honest. I mean, we saw China's rapid island building in the South China Sea in 2013, 2014. We saw them militarize those islands in 2015. This is about preparations. In 2020, from an Australian perspective, Australia reviewed its national defence strategy. It released what was called a Defence Strategic Update. And for the first time since World War II, Australia said, we no longer have 10 years strategic warning time. Now, the concept of 10 years strategic warning time is in some ways a force design concept in Australia, which is you can design a military force around the fact that you'd get 10 years notice if there's going to be a major conflict, and you can fix the gaps and accelerate capability, etc. 6 years ago, Australia said we don't have 10 years notice. So I guess what we're saying here is, this is not a theoretical thing of, look, the risk is changing. This is genuinely, there is potential, not inevitable, but there is potential for a major crisis or conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. And look, there are a range of flashpoints. Now, one of them you've mentioned is China and Taiwan, and I think all of your listeners would be familiar with that. But I think it's important to highlight. You mentioned Taiwan's exercises. I would actually call them demonstrations slash rehearsals. Having been a naval exercise planner, I had this really great job when I was much younger. I got to fly around the entire world and plan naval exercises. It was fantastic. I was platinum on all airlines. It was great. These are not exercises. The intensity of the activities they do around Taiwan, about twice a year, they are very much rehearsals for different scenarios. And one of the things that China has often been critiqued on is being vulnerable when it comes to getting its joint, so its army, air force, navy, and rocket force to work together. Now, since 2015, they have generated theatre commands that are joint commands, so all of those entities working together. And since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in 2022, they have been increasingly upping the ante and rehearsing operations around Taiwan, testing those theatre commands. So I think that when we say they're an exercise, it's kind of like everybody does an exercise, right? These are rehearsals. Now, I'm not saying that China is about to invade Taiwan, and I certainly think that anyone who sits there and says that we know it's all going to happen in 2027, the famous kind of misquoted, often Davidson window, are really kind of oversimplifying the fact. But certainly, we know that Xi Jinping has told the PLA to have the capability to potentially conduct those operations by 2027. I think that's military option is his least preferred option. But we also know that he has said very clearly that he does intend to reunite China and Taiwan. So that is a real flashpoint. But we also see other flashpoints across the South China Sea. We see a range of dangerous operations by the Chinese military, not only towards the Philippines military in their exclusive economic zone. In 2024, we saw, in fact, Philippine sailor lose fingers during an altercation with the Chinese Chinese Coast Guard. But we also see, whenever European countries deploy military assets to the South China Sea, whenever Australia deploys military assets to the South China Sea, which Australia's been doing for decades, we see these unsafe interactions. Chinese helicopters flying directly in front of Australian helicopters, deploying chaff, deploying flare in front of the engines of maritime patrol aircraft. Ships effectively attempting to T-bone other ships. In 2023, we had an incident in Japan's exclusive economic zone where a Chinese destroyer dangerously approached an Australian vessel that was stopped in the water. Under international law, it was signalling that it was diving to free a net from its props. And it continued to radiate its sonar, which every mariner knows is unsafe for divers, and injured Australian divers. So that's another flashpoint, right? But there are a range of flashpoints across the Indo-Pacific. So I guess going back to that point I made before, how should business leaders think about the risk in the Indo-Pacific? Well, certainly that is if definitely not theoretical. It is not just a defense or military issue because of our globalized economy. And all you need to do is look at the Strait of Hormuz right now and the impact that war is having on the global economy. Anything like that occurred in the middle of the Indo-Pacific, which is kind of the engine room for the global economy these days, would have a dramatic impact.
And I think for a long time, at least a decade, we've seen sort of China take two steps forward and at best be pushed back one. But when you're seeing these, what you've just described in really helpful detail, so thanks very much for that, Jennifer. But also, building these artificial islands, we've seen that occur. We saw the dredges move in, we saw the runways being built. Why hasn't or why can't, as a former naval officer and now someone that advises on strategy, why haven't we, being the international community, done more to slow China down or push China back from these activities?
I think that, to be honest, until 2015, people wanted to believe in the peaceful rise of China, right? Which, look, may still be, but we certainly see a very militarized, very aggressive China, which is not what we were thinking when China entered the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s. I think post 2015 until about 2020, till COVID hit, I think most countries didn't want to deal with that problem. They knew what was happening, so they weren't ignoring it anymore, but they really didn't want to talk to the public about it. And they really didn't want to have that conversation in business about what that would mean. I think COVID, certainly in Australia, COVID, some of the things that occurred around that for Australia, it was economic coercion by China, increased incidents with our vessels in the South China Sea. For Australia, 2020 was kind of the wake up call that, the fallacy of the peaceful rise of China. And look, I'm not saying that there's about to be a major conflict, but what I'm saying is the idea that China would economically rise and not militarily rise as well was an absolute fallacy. And so I think it took a lot of countries a long time to wake up to that. I think post 2020, look, the world has had a number of things that they need to focus on, whether it is the impact of COVID, whether it is Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the impacts that is having across Europe, whether it is the multiple crises that have occurred in the Middle East. There are a lot of challenges that have meant that it has been difficult to unite against what is seen as China's military aggression in the Indo-Pacific.
I think that's a really good summary. So thanks very much for that, Jennifer. And I'll take a moment just to remind our listeners that if you prefer to watch your podcasts, the International Risk Podcast is always available on YouTube. So please do go to YouTube and search for the International Risk Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to our content. That really is important for our success. Now, with all that said, Jennifer, that makes a really clear argument about the environment that Australia is operating in and why countries like the UK, US, and of course even NATO now is interested in what capabilities allies have in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, supporters of AUKUS have argued that nuclear-powered submarines will provide Australia with this capability of unprecedented range and endurance, which sounds important and it sounds cool. But critics are countering that this program increases dependence on US technology, US maintenance, US weapons intelligence, and US political approval, which at any time is, perhaps a risk. But certainly in a current administration where we see the Trump administration is much more transactional, that certainly increases the risk. Now, both arguments can be true. It can be a fantastic capability. It can also be a risk. Now, where do you sit on the argument, and how do you view the what the AUKUS brings to Australia?
It's interesting when Australia's plan to acquire nuclear powered submarines was announced in September 21. I was actually working in force design, and we got an indication that within the Australian Department of Defence, and we got an indication that something big was going to be announced, but we didn't actually know. It had been kept secret from the majority of the Department of Defence for 12 to 18 months. When it was announced, I was kind of surprised, and I kind of thought, well, I don't know if this is a great idea. The reason I thought that, though, is less about many of the arguments made by AUKUS skeptics right now, because I think a lot of those arguments are, to be honest, quite weak, and we can talk through why, and more about, for me, whether it unbalanced the maritime force within Australia, focused too much on submarines. And of course, Australia being an island nation, it needs a broad maritime capability. I guess my fears around that were allayed slightly in 2024 when the Australian government actually announced the expansion of Australia's surface combatant fleet, which is the first Australian government to do that since World War II. Now, that expansion is not happening till the 2030s, and I won't get into detail on that because we are talking about nuclear-powered submarines. But I think the point there is Australia is doing much more than just nuclear-powered submarines, and there is a real focus on nuclear-powered submarines. One, it's different. We will be the eighth country in the world to get nuclear powered submarines. I guess when we then go to kind of the criticisms of AUKUS, look, it is expensive. The Australian government, put out a figure of $368 billion in 2023 when the optimal pathways, the plan that Australia has to acquire nuclear powered submarines, was released. And that figure is big. It's also often misunderstood. So that's not $368 billion for 8 nuclear powered submarines, which is Australia's current plan. It's $368 billion to build the workforce, pay the workforce, build the infrastructure, uh, buy 3 Virginia class submarines, build our own submarine industrial base, build those submarines, and then operate and sustain them through to 2055. So when we think about that figure that I've mentioned, it is not just acquisition, it's acquisition and sustainment, and a term that we use in defence in Australia in all of the other fundamental inputs to capability, so workforce, training, infrastructure, etc. I guess the second thing that is critiqued, and you mentioned this here, which is dependency on the US. So I think this is a really interesting point. When Australia and the US, and in fact New Zealand, Australia and New Zealand allies as well, signed the ANZUS Treaty in 1951, in the lead up to that, academics who specialise in the ANZUS Treaty, which is not me, but those who have written PhDs about it will tell you that the US was reluctant to sign it because they did not want dependencies in the Indo-Pacific. They did not want New Zealand and Australia to become dependent. Throughout the Cold War, whether it is the Guam Doctrine in 1968, whether it's other moments, the US reminds countries like Australia that they need to do more for their own defence. From the end of the Cold War, in my view, Australia became too reliant on the US, but not because the US wanted it to be, not because we made a strategic decision, but because Australia believed deeply in the concept of the end of history, the idea that globalization would reduce the chances of conflict, state on state conflict, and underinvested in defence. So Australia's dependency on the US now, which is more dependency than I would recommend, and we talk a lot in Australia about self reliance within the alliance, is because of a lack of spending on defence capability. I would say increasing Australia's defence capability, having better ability to protect the third largest maritime domain in the world, fifth largest user of shipping in the world, which Australia also is, actually makes us less dependent. The second thing I'd say in terms of the technology dependency, which is the point about submarines, and I mean, this is a good point. Like the 3 submarines that we will buy from the US in the 2030s will be Virginia class submarines. We will rely heavily on the US to teach us how to operate those. We already buy all of our fighter aircraft, all except one of our smart missiles, our combat systems in our destroyers, all of these vital defense technologies already come from the US. So I would argue, are we dependent on the US for military technology? Yes. Does that start with AUKUS? No. Does AUKUS make us more dependent on the US? In my view, not really. A lot of people have said, well, since the Trump administration is transactional, how can you guarantee they're going to sell you those 3 submarines? And look, in geopolitics, there are definitely no guarantees. But what I would say is countries work together when it's in their national interests to do so. And the AUKUS deal is very much in the US's national interests. And we have seen actually since the new US administration, more support for AUKUS than we had previously. We've seen Trump himself say it is full steam ahead. So that doesn't mean there's no risk. But what I would say is when you think about a lot of those criticisms of AUKUS, and I mean, this is an expensive project. Absolutely, it should be debated. And there are elements of truth to all of those criticisms. But when you start to break them down, whether it is cost, whether it is making us more dependence and our overall dependency on the US, or whether it is kind of the transactional nature of the US, when you're assessing the risk of all of those, you have to say, well, we know the risk. Are we mitigating the risk? Yes, it seems to be, not to quote President Trump, but kind of full steam ahead right now.
I think your point about these dependencies is really solid. And of course, AUKUS is that alliance between UK, US, and Australia, long term partners. And for decades, at least since the 50s, many Indo Pacific strategies, including Australia's, have rested on this assumption of continued American military presence, of continued engagement economically and, of course, political reliability. But US politics, US domestic politics have become much less predictable, and Washington's priorities, as we've seen, can change quite quickly between administrations. And taking us on to capabilities, which you also spoke about, I wonder if Australia needs to do anything else. I mean, how should Australia plan for the possibility that America's capability, whilst it remains formidable, America's political commitment can shift? And that's not something new. Trump isn't the first US president to shift priorities significantly. Is there anything else Australia needs to do? We saw, I was in Ukraine when the US pulled its intelligence support for a short period of time, and it really just absolutely crippled the Ukrainians. And I was saying to soldiers on the front line, but what about the French? What about the British? They're supporting as well. And they just sort of looked at me and laughed, and they went, no, 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 no. Only America has this sort of intelligence that we need to do our targeting. So, what else should Australia be doing to make sure that we have the own internal capacity to step up?
I think that often the conversation around Australia's defence kind of starts and ends with AUKUS, which I think is wrong. And I mentioned before that another historic announcement of the current Australian government is the plan to double the size of the Australian surface combatant fleet. Now, something that should have happened decades ago, but Australia is doing a number of things, whether it is AUKUS, whether it is more ships, whether it is more amphibious capability for army. We are pivoting the army towards being a littoral focus. Don't call them Marines; they'll get upset. They're not Marines; they're the army. But littoral focus with maritime strike capability. So Australia's doing a range of things. But I guess and this is a point relevant for alliances. It's also a point relevant for businesses. The thing that Australia needs to understand is what are its dependencies. What are its dependencies on the US? What is it comfortable being dependent on the US for? And what is it uncomfortable being dependent on the US for? And now that lack of comfort, those things that it's uncomfortable being dependent on the US for, that's not necessarily because the US might change its priorities. It might, but the US is fairly invested in Indo-Pacific for, to be honest, economic and security reasons. But it might be that actually, say Australia decides that it's happy to be dependent on US constellations for ISR, US satellite constellations, and then or for satellite communications. And then the US is embroiled in something, and actually it needs to direct those assets towards that. Now, there's not a falling out in the relationship. The US hasn't sold out Australia, but it needs to prioritize its assets. In that case, is Australia comfortable being that dependent? So the first thing, as I said, is does Australia understand its dependencies? The second thing is, okay, well, what are the things it is comfortable being dependent on? What are the things it is uncomfortable? And if there is a gap there, then starting to build its own organic capability or develop other relationships. And Australia has been doubling down on relationships with Japan, for example, with India, for example. The Australia Indonesia relationship looks very different now than it did 10 years ago. So, how does it mitigate what are really those vulnerabilities because of its dependency on certain aspects of the alliance? So, I think that's how Australia needs to think about it. And I think people aren't wrong to say that the US will always prioritize the US. Of course, they will. I mean, countries should always put themselves first. I'm not pushing for an Australia first policy. That phrase is now ruined forever. But countries should act in their own national interests, and you should expect other countries to act in their own national interests. And so you should look at how do you protect your national interests. So yes, Australia needs a broader capability than just nuclear powered submarines. And I think that, to be fair, Australia is doing that. One of the challenges for Australia, though, I think, is that Australian governments are still unwilling to invest in defence at the levels that they need.
And I'd love to ask you, Jennifer, having spent decades in the military and in the Navy, can you talk to us through, because as you said, the Taiwan crisis wouldn't necessarily need to be a full scale invasion to disrupt the world's economy. It could be a blockade, as we saw, China start to demonstrate when Nancy Pelosi visited. Could be a quarantine, could be extensive cyber campaigns, or extended or sustained military exercises, or even contested inspection regimes and tariff enforcements of Taiwan. So it could take many aspects. But talk to us, if there was a serious Taiwan crisis, what would the first 7 days look like for Australia? What would Australia's involvement be? What would that mean for the military? What would we need to consider? What would that look like?
The point you just made there that it could be many different scenarios is important. I think there is a danger sometimes that you generate groupthink around one certain strategic outcome. and actually you forget that there are a range of outcomes. And in fact, in some ways, some of those more prolonged, lower threshold outcomes could have an actual more significant impact on the global economy, whether that is a quarantine, whether that is ongoing cyber attacks, et cetera, et cetera. Look, my personal view is I don't think that Xi Jinping has made the decision about what he's going to do about Taiwan. I think it really depends on how the world evolves, how much confidence he has in his military, and whether he gets to the point that he thinks that it can't be acquired any other way. So I think that it is conditions based, not time based. Now, I won't go through all of those conditions for time on this podcast because your question was, what would Australia do? I worry that we make the assumption when we think about the Taiwan scenario, having acknowledged that there are many scenarios, that China would not use the military option. I think that we have a default bias that we think that states don't use military options, right? Like they don't do that. But when we go back to that trend that I've mentioned a couple of times during this podcast, actually what we're seeing is states increasingly use military options. And, that statistic in 2024, more state on state conflict than any other time since World War II. So I worry that the option may actually be um, a significant crisis overnight. So a decision to attack Taiwan as opposed to quarantine, as opposed to a blockade. So I worry that actually the calculation will be a quick regional conflict striking US bases in the Philippines and US and potentially Japanese bases in Japan, with potential crisis on the Korean Peninsula. In the event of that scenario, I think Australia's role in the Australian military is actually to keep Australia functioning. It's less about operating up threat in the Taiwan Strait. It's more about keeping Australia functioning because for our friends and partners in the region, Australia provides strategic depth. Whether it's Japan, whether it's South Korea, whether it is the Philippines, Australia, or the US, Australia provides strategic depth. Australia provides a place where you can move your drone production, you can move your ship production. So keeping Australia protected and keeping the ability for trade to come to Australia, and also supporting our partners and allies in the region with our critical exports. Australian exports are actually critical to energy security to a number of countries across this region. I think that's the role of the Australian military in that large crisis scenario that I've explained.
Thanks very much for unpacking that. And there's so many more questions I'd love to ask you, Jennifer. But as we come to a close, I think it would be remiss if we didn't talk about Pillar 2 of the AUKUS agreement. And I think these capabilities might be seen much more quickly. And for many of our listeners, they might be more interesting as well. They're around artificial intelligence, autonomy, cyber, quantum technologies, electronic warfare, undersea systems. We saw US deploy its first attack drone in the Strait of Hormuz recently. Can you talk to us about what excites you the most? Just briefly, what excites you the most about this second pillar of the AUKUS treaty?
Now, when it comes to AUKUS Pillar 2, look, it's hard to actually say what's happening in AUKUS Pillar 2. One explanation for that is that these technologies and collaboration on them are so highly classified that there's not going to be a lot in the public domain. Now, we saw one announcement this year, which was about the three countries working together on payloads for uncrewed underwater vehicles, so offensive payloads, potentially communications payloads, etc. The second element is I do worry, back to that damn money conversation, is there's not necessarily a lot of money behind AUKUS Pillar 2. But I think in terms of what excites me the most, look, I do think that working on collaborating on solving some of the problems in the underwater domain, which clearly has been a focus for the three countries. How do you communicate with uncrewed underwater vehicles, for example? I think that's very interesting. Now, many of your listeners are like, what are you talking about and why do you care about that? The underwater domain, we didn't get into transparent ocean theory, the idea that submarines going to be obsolete and all that sort of stuff. The underwater domain is a really difficult domain. One of my jobs many years ago now in 2014 was as the N3, so the current ops manager in our joint headquarters, sadly searching for MH370 in the Indian Ocean. And people were like, how can you not find that? The underwater domain is a very difficult domain to be able to see and act in. So the idea that those countries might be working on and cracking the nut about how you might communicate through the underwater domain, I think that's pretty exciting.
And Jennifer, just in the last 30 seconds, one question that we ask all guests on the International Risk podcast is, when you look around the world, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
I think that countries are learning this and companies are learning this, but do global companies understand their dependencies, where their inputs come from, and where the risks are associated with that? And I think that if you think about how much of that is dependent on an uncontested maritime domain, well, that has fundamentally changed. And whether you're talking about subsea cables and the data that runs through them, or you're talking about the goods that come on ships, you cannot assume that in certain areas of the world that will be uncontested.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for explaining that, Jennifer. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, that was a great conversation with Jennifer Parker, and I really appreciated hearing her thoughts on the future of AUKUS, on geopolitics, and of course, the associated risks and opportunities of the current alliance. Today's episode was produced and coordinated by Celia Irving. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again soon.